Stop calling me your wife. The maid's shocking secret left the billionaire speechless. The maid slammed the tray down and looked the billionaire dead in the eye. Stop calling me your wife, she said, her voice shaking. Behind her, his fiancée smiled like she'd already won. But what none of them knew was that a folded letter in the maid's apron pocket was about to destroy everything the billionaire thought he understood about his own life. And in exactly 6 days, one wedding would never happen. Welcome back to another story about secrets, betrayal, and the moments that change everything. If you love stories about hidden truths and the strength it takes to speak up, you're exactly where you need to be. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Daniel Ashford didn't believe in love at first sight. He believed in spreadsheets, quarterly earnings, and the quiet, careful math of trust. That was why, at 36, he was still surprised by how easily Vanessa Cole had gotten past every wall he'd built. They'd met at a charity gala 18 months earlier. She was polished and quick-witted, the kind of woman who knew which fork to use and never let her smile drop, even when the room got difficult. Daniel's late mother used to say that a person's true face only showed up when nobody important was watching. He hadn't thought to test that theory with Vanessa. He should have. The engagement had been announced 3 months ago, and the wedding was set for the first Saturday of June, 6 weeks away, and the entire Ashford estate had turned into a staging ground for it. Florists came and went. A wedding planner named Renata practically lived in the East Wing. And into the middle of all that chaos walked Naomi Carter. She was 26, quiet in the way that made people underestimate her, and she'd been hired 2 weeks earlier as a housemaid after the previous one left abruptly, a detail nobody at Ashford House seemed eager to explain. Naomi didn't ask questions. She needed the job too badly to risk it. Her daughter Ivy was 3 years old, all curious eyes and quick little observations, and daycare wasn't cheap in this part of Connecticut. Naomi kept her head down. She learned the house's rhythms fast. Which hallways needed the vacuum before Daniel came home, which vases Vanessa liked filled with white lilies instead of roses, which rooms Vanessa didn't want touched at all. She didn't ask why the locked study at the end of the west hallway was off limits. She just avoided it the way she avoided most things that could get her fired. The first time Daniel really noticed her wasn't dramatic. It was small. He'd come home late from a meeting in the city, exhausted, and found her in the kitchen at nearly 10 at night, still working, boxing up leftover catering food instead of throwing it away. "You don't have to do that," he said. She startled, nearly dropping a container. "Sorry, Mr. Ashford. It felt wasteful to toss it. I was going to ask the caterer if it could go to the shelter on Route 9. He studied her for a second too long. Most people who worked in this house tried to disappear when he was around. She hadn't disappeared. She just kept working. "That's a good idea," he said finally. "Do that from now on if there's ever extra." It was such a small exchange. It shouldn't have mattered. But Vanessa saw it. She'd come down the stairs just in time to catch the tail end of the conversation, and something in her expression flickered, there and gone so fast that Daniel didn't catch it. Naomi did. From that night, small things started happening. A vase Naomi had polished that morning turned up broken by evening, and Vanessa mentioned, sweetly casually in front of Daniel, that she'd heard the new girl was careless. A blouse Vanessa claimed was missing from her closet turned up 2 days later in a laundry basket Naomi hadn't touched, but by then the accusation had already been planted like a seed. Daniel brushed it off each time. Vanessa was stressed with the wedding, he told himself. People got tense before big life events. He'd known her a year and a half. He'd known this maid 2 weeks. There was no reason to doubt the woman he was about to marry over a housekeeping mix-up. But something about Naomi Carter unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. Not attraction. Or not only that, though he wouldn't have admitted even to himself how her calm, steady presence in a house full of forced smiles had started to feel like the only honest thing in the building. It was something else. A familiarity. A strange sense, every time she spoke, that he'd heard that voice somewhere before, in a life that didn't quite line up with the one he was living now. He mentioned it once to his assistant, Marcus, almost as a joke. "Does the new maid seem familiar to you?" Marcus had looked at him strangely. "Familiar how?" "I don't know." "Forget it." He couldn't forget it. That night, alone in his office, he found himself staring at an old photograph on his shelf. Himself at 28, at a conference in Atlanta, a version of his life from before Vanessa, before all of this. He couldn't have said why the photograph was suddenly on his mind. But he picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, and set it back down with his hands not quite steady. 2 floors below, Naomi tucked Ivy into the small guest cottage the estate provided for live-in staff, and pulled a folded worn letter from the bottom of her bag. One she'd read so many times the creases were starting to tear. She didn't open it that night. She just held it, the way she always did when the walls of Ashford House felt like they were closing in, and whispered to her sleeping daughter, "We're going to be okay. I promise." She had no idea that upstairs, the man who owned this house was staring at a photograph of a woman he barely remembered anymore. A woman from a night in Atlanta 8 years ago that he'd convinced himself didn't matter. It was about to matter more than anything else in his life. By the 3rd week, Vanessa's campaign against Naomi had sharpened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of cruelty you could point to and call cruelty. It was quieter than that, the kind designed to survive scrutiny. "I just think," Vanessa said one evening, curled against Daniel on the couch, her voice honey-soft, "that we should be careful who we let get close to the family stuff. You know, some people, they see an opportunity in a house like this." "Naomi hasn't done anything," Daniel said. "I didn't say she did anything." Vanessa's fingers traced idle circles on his arm. "I'm just saying, be careful. That's all. I love you too much not to say something." It was a masterclass in doubt, planted so gently it didn't even feel like doubt, it felt like concern. And concern, coming from the woman he was about to marry, was hard to argue with. Meanwhile, Naomi's days had gotten harder. Vanessa began leaving her lists of impossible tasks with impossible deadlines, then criticizing the results in front of the household staff. She misplaced a pair of earrings and let it slip within Naomi's hearing that she was thinking of calling the police to get to the bottom of it, before finding them in her own jewelry box an hour later, with a shrug and no apology. Naomi said nothing. She couldn't afford to. Every dollar from this job went toward Ivy's daycare and the modest apartment they were saving to move back into, once Naomi had enough saved to leave the live-in position behind. She'd learned a long time ago that people like Vanessa Cole didn't get challenged by people like her. Not without consequences that landed on the powerless person, never the powerful one. But then came the incident with the study. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel was in the city, Vanessa was at a fitting, and Naomi was vacuuming the hallway when she noticed the study door, always locked, standing slightly open. She hesitated. She wasn't supposed to go in there. But a folder had slid halfway out from under the door, papers spilling onto the hallway floor, clearly knocked loose by whoever had left in a hurry. She knelt to gather them, meaning only to set them back inside the door, and one page caught her eye before she could stop herself. It was a private investigator's report. The header read, "Subject and Carter." Her hands went cold. She didn't read further. She couldn't. Footsteps were coming down the hall, quick and certain, and she barely managed to slide the folder back through the door and push it shut before Vanessa rounded the corner, back early from her fitting. Vanessa's eyes went straight to the study door, then to Naomi, then back to the door. For one suspended second, something raw and unguarded crossed her face. Real panic, not performed. Then it was gone, replaced by that practiced sweetness. "What were you doing near the study?" Vanessa asked, light as anything. The door was open. I was just tidying the hallway, Naomi said, keeping her voice level, betraying nothing. Vanessa studied her for a long moment. Of course, she said finally. You know that room is off limits though. Daniel's very particular about it. I understand. But Vanessa didn't move. She stood there a beat too long, and when she finally walked away, she looked back once. A look Naomi couldn't read, but one that made the hair on her arms stand up. That night, Naomi lay awake beside Ivy's small sleeping form, turning over the two words burned into her memory. A private investigator's report. Her. Why would Vanessa Cole, a woman she'd known for 3 weeks, a woman who had every reason in the world to have nothing to do with her, be paying someone to investigate a housemaid? Unless it wasn't about the housemaid at all. Unless it was about someone Naomi used to be before Ashford House, before any of this. Daniel, unaware of any of it, came home that night distracted and quiet. Over dinner, he found himself watching Naomi as she cleared the table, the same unplaceable familiarity needling at him. On impulse, before he could think better of it, he asked her, "Have we met before? Before you started working here, I mean." Naomi's hands stilled for half a second on the plate she was holding. "I don't think so, Mr. Ashford." It wasn't quite a lie. It also wasn't quite the truth. "Funny," he said, watching her carefully now. "You have a way of saying things that reminds me of someone." "I get that a lot," she said, and left the room before he could ask anything else. He sat alone at the long dining table, the photograph from Atlanta suddenly vivid in his mind again. A bar, a conference, a woman whose name he'd never fully caught in the noise of the night, a woman he'd spent one honest, unguarded evening with before losing her number in the chaos of an early flight home. He'd told himself for years that it didn't matter. Single night, nothing more. Except Ivy would be turning 4 in the fall. And Naomi had been working here for 3 weeks. And he still didn't know exactly how old her daughter was. He didn't let himself finish the thought. Not yet. It felt too impossible, too much like something from a movie and not his actual, careful, ordered life. But upstairs in the locked study, Vanessa Cole sat at Daniel's desk with the private investigator's folder open in front of her, staring at a photograph clipped inside it. A photograph of Naomi Carter from years earlier, standing beside a man whose face made Vanessa's stomach twist with something that looked a great deal like fear. She closed the folder. Her wedding was in 5 weeks. She had no intention of letting anything or anyone take it from her. The next few days moved with the strange, taut quiet of a house holding its breath. Vanessa changed tactics. Where before she'd been subtle, now she grew colder, more deliberate. She began finding reasons to have Naomi dismissed from rooms the moment Daniel entered them. She started making comments about loyalty and who you can really trust, aimed at Daniel but clearly meant for Naomi to overhear. Then came the accusation that nearly ended everything. Vanessa's engagement ring, a family heirloom insured for an amount that made the local police take the call seriously, went missing from her bedroom. She reported it within the hour, tears perfectly timed, voice trembling as she told Daniel that the last person she'd seen near her room that morning was Naomi. "I'm not accusing anyone," Vanessa said, in the exact tone of someone accusing everyone. "I just need it found before the wedding." Daniel felt something in him resist the idea immediately, and that resistance surprised him. 2 weeks ago, he might have simply trusted Vanessa's account without question. But he'd been watching too closely lately, noticing too much, and something about the timing, this happening right after the incident with the study, didn't sit right. Still, protocol was protocol. He had no choice but to ask Naomi about it directly in the sitting room, with Vanessa present, arms crossed, watching. "I didn't take it," Naomi said quietly. "I haven't been in her room since Tuesday, and I never touch personal jewelry unless I'm asked to." "She's lying," Vanessa said immediately. Daniel, she was seen coming out of my room this morning. By who? Daniel asked. Vanessa hesitated just slightly, just long enough. One of the security cameras. I checked the footage. It was a mistake, and a small one, but Daniel caught it. You checked the footage yourself? Before telling security? Vanessa's jaw tightened. I wanted to be sure before I made accusations. Then show me the footage. For the first time since Daniel had known her, Vanessa Cole looked genuinely cornered. The system had a glitch this morning. It didn't record. The room went very quiet. Naomi stood there, dignified and still, refusing to let her fear show even as her heart pounded. She thought of Ivy in the cottage, of the letter in her bag, of every reason she had to simply apologize and let this go rather than risk her job, but something in her refused to bend. I would never take something that isn't mine, she said, steady. I've worked too hard for what little I have to throw it away over a ring. If you want to search my things, search them. I have nothing to hide. Daniel looked between the two women. His composed, dignified housemaid and his fiancée, whose story was falling apart in real time, and something inside him shifted permanently. Search her things then, Vanessa pressed. If she's innocent, she won't mind. Fine, Naomi said before Daniel could answer. Search them. They found nothing. Course they found nothing. And that evening, while the household staff quietly speculated in the kitchen, the ring turned up exactly where it had apparently been the whole time, inside a jewelry box in Vanessa's own closet, mysteriously overlooked in the initial search. Vanessa apologized to Naomi with a tight, humiliated smile, blaming her own scattered nerves before the wedding. Daniel accepted the apology on the surface. Underneath it, something had cracked wide open, and he knew it wasn't going to close again. That night, unable to sleep, he made a decision he wouldn't have made a month earlier. He went to the locked study. His own study, the one Vanessa had somehow claimed dominion over during wedding preparations, and found it unlocked. And on the desk, half hidden under a stack of seating charts, a manila folder with a single name typed across the tab. Carter N. He opened it. Inside were photographs, surveillance photographs, professional and recent, of Naomi outside her old apartment, at a grocery store, at Ivy's daycare. There was a background check. And clipped to the very back, an old photograph that stopped Daniel's breath entirely. Himself, 8 years younger, standing beside a laughing young woman at a hotel bar in Atlanta, an image that could only have come from an old social media account he barely remembered having. Attached to it was a single handwritten note in Vanessa's looping script. She can't know he's the father. Handle this before the wedding. Daniel sat down slowly in his own study, the folder trembling slightly in his hands, and for the first time in 18 months, he understood that the woman he was about to marry was not who he thought she was, and the woman scrubbing his floors every day might be carrying a secret far bigger than either of them had let on. Ivy. Math. Dates. His daughter. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat with the folder until the sun came up, going over every photograph, every note, piecing together a timeline Vanessa had clearly spent months constructing and even longer trying to hide. The picture that emerged was ugly. Vanessa had known about Naomi, about the child, about the Atlanta connection, long before Naomi had ever applied for a job at Ashford House. In fact, the investigators' notes made it clear this wasn't a coincidence at all. Vanessa had learned, through channels Daniel didn't yet fully understand, that a woman named Naomi Carter existed, that she had a daughter roughly the right age, and that this daughter might be biologically Daniel's. A threat, in Vanessa's eyes, to the marriage, the inheritance, and the life she'd built her identity around securing. Rather than warn Daniel, rather than let the truth surface on its own, Vanessa had done something far colder. She'd arranged, through a staffing agency contact, to have Naomi hired directly into the household, not out of guilt or generosity, but so she could keep her close, controlled, and discredited. If Naomi could be made to look unstable, dishonest, or desperate before anyone ever tested the truth, then no one would believe her if she ever came forward. That was the plan. That was why the missing vase, the earrings, the ring, all of it had happened. Not spontaneous cruelty. Campaign. Daniel confronted her the next morning in the study, the folder open on the desk between them. Vanessa's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, calculation, then something that finally cracked into raw panic. "Daniel, I can explain. Is Ivy mine?" His voice was quiet. Quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I don't know. That's not confirmed. I was trying to protect you from a woman who could be lying about. You hired a private investigator to surveil a woman and her 3-year-old daughter, brought her into my house under false pretenses, and spent weeks trying to get her fired or arrested rather than telling me the truth." Daniel's hands were flat on the desk, steadying himself. "That's not protecting me, Vanessa. That's protecting yourself. Everything I did because I love you," Vanessa said, tears rising, and for a moment it almost sounded believable. "I didn't want to lose you over some mistake from before we even met." "You didn't want to lose the wedding," he said. "There's a difference." Downstairs, unaware that any of this was happening, Naomi was folding laundry in the small utility room when Vanessa found her. Alone, no witnesses, eyes red-rimmed and furious. "You think you've won something," Vanessa said, voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You think showing up here with your sob story and your kid is going to get you a fairy tale ending. It won't. I will make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of woman shows up somewhere pretending she doesn't know whose house she's really in." Naomi set down the towel she was folding, her hands steady even though her heart was pounding. "I never asked to work here because of Daniel," she said. "I took this job because I needed money for my daughter, and this house was hiring. I didn't even know it was his house until I showed up for the interview, and by then I needed the paycheck too badly to walk away. I have spent 3 weeks being humiliated by you for things I didn't do, and I stayed quiet because I had no other choice. But I am done being quiet." "You'll lose," Vanessa hissed. "You have no money, no lawyer, no family here. I have everything." "Stop calling me your wife's maid like that means you own me," Naomi said, her voice rising for the first time in 3 weeks, cutting clean through Vanessa's threat. "I am not property in this house. And whatever happens next, I am not afraid of you anymore." It was at that exact moment that Daniel appeared in the doorway, having heard the last part of the exchange, the folder still in his hand. Vanessa turned, and for one terrible second, all 3 of them stood frozen. The man who had just learned the shape of the lie he'd been living inside, the woman who had built that lie, and the woman who had been made to pay for it. "Everyone out at the wedding reception is asking about seating charts," Vanessa said, absurdly, grasping for normalcy. "We should." "There isn't going to be a wedding," Daniel said quietly. The words landed in the room like something breaking. Word moved fast through Ashford House once the engagement officially ended, though Daniel made sure the full story never became gossip fodder for the staff. That much, at least, he could still control. Vanessa left within 48 hours, her belongings packed by a moving crew while she stayed at a hotel, too proud or too humiliated to watch it happen in person. The ring, the real one, the family heirloom, she left on the desk in the study, along with a note Daniel never bothered to read. What mattered more to him was the DNA test. He asked Naomi for it directly, gently, with none of the entitlement Vanessa had used to try to control the narrative. "I need to know," he told her, sitting across from her in the kitchen one evening after Ivy had gone to sleep. "Not because I doubt you. Because I want to do this the right way, for her sake and yours." Naomi agreed without hesitation. She'd tried years ago to reach him after Atlanta. A number that no longer worked, an email that bounced, a life that had moved on before she'd even known she was pregnant. She'd raised Ivy alone since, working 3 jobs some years, never once expecting the world to owe her anything, never once telling Ivy stories about a father who might come looking. The results came back 12 days later. Ivy was his. Daniel cried the first time he held his daughter and understood fully what that meant. Not the paperwork, but the years he'd missed, the birthdays, the first steps, all of it unfolding somewhere he hadn't known to look. He didn't try to rush anything. He didn't sweep in and demand instant custody or try to buy his way into a role he hadn't earned yet. Instead, he asked Naomi what she needed, and he listened. What she needed, it turned out, wasn't money, though he made sure she'd never have to worry about it again. What she needed was respect, the kind she'd been denied for 3 humiliating weeks, the kind Vanessa had tried to strip from her with every quiet cruelty. Daniel gave her that. He moved her and Ivy out of the small staff cottage and into an apartment in town, close enough for regular visits, far enough that Naomi never again had to live inside the house of a man who employed her. Ivy, for her part, adjusted the way children often do, with curiosity rather than confusion. She liked the tall man who came to visit on Wednesdays and Saturdays, who was patient enough to sit through 3 readings of the same picture book, who never once made her feel like an inconvenience or a scandal. One evening, watching him carefully build a block tower with her on the living room floor, she looked up and asked simply, "Are you my daddy now?" Daniel looked at Naomi over their daughter's head, and something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but a quiet kind of trust that neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of the last month. "I always was," he told Ivy gently. "I just didn't know it yet." As for Vanessa, the consequences weren't dramatic or cruel. Daniel made sure of that, despite Marcus's suggestion that legal action over the surveillance and the false accusation of theft might be warranted. Instead, the story simply became known, quietly, in the circles that mattered to Vanessa most. The country club, the charity boards, the wedding that never happened. People began to remember, suddenly, small cruelties they'd once overlooked. Invitations stopped coming. The engagement's dissolution, and the reasons behind it, followed her in a way she couldn't outrun or spin, not because Daniel destroyed her, but because the truth, once it was finally free, didn't need his help to spread. 6 months later, Naomi stood in the small backyard of her new apartment, watching Ivy chase bubbles that Daniel was blowing for her, laughing in a way Naomi hadn't heard in years. She thought about the letter she'd carried in her bag for so long, the one she'd never had the courage to send, addressed to a man she'd assumed had forgotten her entirely. She'd finally shown it to him 2 weeks ago. He'd read it twice, then folded it carefully and asked if he could keep it. She hadn't expected forgiveness or justice to look like this, quiet, steady, unremarkable in its kindness. But watching her daughter's father chase her daughter across the grass, she understood that some of the best endings didn't come with fireworks. They came with someone finally choosing to show up and staying. If you were in Naomi's position, would you have stayed silent to protect your job, or spoken up the moment you found out the truth? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and go check out another story waiting for you right now.